say to you?
That he felt that this child was his. And even if the child was not his, Mr. Gates would still stepped up and he would have been a father.
Before he passed away, that he was not the father of Nicholas.
That he felt in his heart that he was the father of my child.
I could tell he was being very honest. I could see the sadness in his face when he told me that.
Also, Mr. Gates and I were also fighting at the time. Mr. Gates was going to say what he had to his mom.
What would he?
Of course he would step up.
Father.
He was a great father. He raised her daughter. She was pregnant when they met. So of course he would step up.
He never doubted to you at all, or was there doubt?
Yes, there was some doubt, Mr. Gates, with Alexis. Nicholas, I had found out I was pregnant, and he told me he would not be able to live with knowing I was pregnant with another man's baby. And
this court case unfolds as a deeply emotional legal examination where the relationship between law and justice is tested through science, testimony, and unresolved pain. Presided over by Judge Lauren Lake, the matter centers on paternity, identity, and the consequences that follow when doubt lingers for years. From the very beginning, the court makes it clear that this is not only about biology, but about accountability, memory, and the concept of justice in jurisprudence. The first dispute presented to the court involves a grieving mother seeking clarity after the death of her son. She appears not to accuse, but to defend his honor. Her position is that her late son privately expressed doubt about being the biological father of 2 children shortly before his passing. The opposing party, the children's mother, arrives with certainty of her own, stating that the deceased man accepted the children as his and loved them regardless of doubt. This clash immediately places the evidence stage in divorce case, style proceedings, even though the central figure is no longer alive. Judge Lauren Lake carefully navigates this sensitive situation by grounding the discussion in law, not emotion. The court acknowledges that verbal statements, no matter how sincere, cannot outweigh scientific verification. This is where the DNA test becomes the only neutral voice in the courtroom. Because the alleged father is deceased, the court orders kinship testing using the surviving parent, demonstrating how modern courts adapt evidence rules while avoiding adverse inference in Evidence Act scenarios. As testimony unfolds, the courtroom hears admissions of infidelity, overlapping relationships, and instability, elements commonly discussed in DNA test cheating stories that leave children caught between adults' decisions. Both parties acknowledge doubt existed at different times, reinforcing why courts rely on scientific evidence rather than personal belief. Judge Lake emphasizes that doubt does not equal guilt, nor does love equal biological certainty. When the DNA results are revealed, the court witnesses a pivotal moment that reflects the phrase "truth changes everything" podcast listeners often reference. One child is confirmed biologically connected, validating years of uncertainty. The second result initially appears inconclusive, prompting expert testimony from a forensic scientist. This demonstrates the legal system's commitment to accuracy rather than convenience, reinforcing the court's role as a guardian of truth rather than speed. Further testing confirms that both children share the same biological father, resolving doubt entirely. The result not only clarifies lineage, but also redefines family responsibility. Judge Lauren Lake addresses the emotional consequences with balance, acknowledging grief while reminding all parties that children deserve stability beyond courtroom verdicts. This segment mirrors themes often explored in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal clarity reshapes lives long after rulings are issued. The second case transitions into a different but equally complex dispute involving adult siblings and long-standing rumors of infidelity. Here, the court examines claims that a father secretly had a child with his wife's best friend decades earlier. The individuals involved arrive not as strangers, but as people who grew up together under false labels, illustrating how unresolved truth can distort identity across generations. Judge Lake allows each party to explain their understanding of the past, but firmly distinguishes hearsay from evidence. Emotional recollections, childhood memories, and family photographs are presented, yet none are treated as conclusive. This reinforces the principle that courts cannot rule on belief alone, a foundational lesson often highlighted in Supreme Court child support precedents where proof outweighs narrative. A siblingship DNA test is ordered, reflecting the court's adaptability when direct parental testing is impossible. The results confirm biological ties, ending decades of speculation. While the ruling resolves legal uncertainty, Judge Lake acknowledges that emotional reconciliation may take longer. Her closing remarks emphasize empathy, responsibility, and restraint, echoing values promoted in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where truth is the first step, not the final one. The final dispute presented to the court focuses on a married couple locked in mistrust, accusations of infidelity, and conflicting timelines. The husband petitions for a DNA test, citing inconsistent behavior and rumors. The wife maintains certainty while admitting to relationship instability. Judge Lake cuts through the chaos by reframing the issue. The court is not judging morality, only paternity. This portion of the case reflects common discussions found in the Divorce Course podcast, where breakdowns in communication and boundaries escalate into legal intervention. Witness testimony introduces more doubt, but again, the court refuses to speculate. The DNA test becomes the decisive factor, confirming paternity and ending the dispute definitively. Judge Lauren Lake delivers a firm admonishment, reminding both parties that marriage without accountability leads to harm beyond the adults involved. Her ruling reinforces that legal truth does not erase emotional damage, but it does establish responsibility. The court orders clarity, co-parenting, and maturity moving forward, reinforcing how law functions as a stabilizing force amid personal disorder. Across all proceedings, the courtroom becomes a space where science intersects with human emotion, and where adoption stories full episodes. Style revelations are mirrored through biological discovery rather than legal placement. Each ruling underscores that courts exist not to shame, but to resolve. This description captures how, under Judge Lauren Lake's guidance, the court systematically separates truth from assumption, ensuring that every decision rests on verified evidence. In each case, the DNA test does more than determine biology. It reshapes identity, responsibility, and the future for everyone involved. As the courtroom proceedings continue, a clear pattern emerges. Every case brought before Judge Lauren Lake is not merely about determining biological facts, but about untangling years of emotional damage created by uncertainty. The court repeatedly returns to one central principle: the law cannot heal wounds, but it can stop confusion from spreading further. This philosophy anchors each ruling and defines how justice is delivered throughout these cases. In the earlier disputes, the DNA test functioned as a neutral authority, cutting through conflicting memories and emotionally charged testimony. Here, Judge Lake reinforces that scientific evidence is not an accusation, it is a resolution. This distinction matters because many individuals entering the courtroom already feel judged by their families and communities. The court's role, therefore, is not to amplify shame, but to establish truth with clarity and restraint, echoing discussions often heard on the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Throughout the hearings, Judge Lake consistently reminds the parties that doubt itself is not a crime. In relationships marked by instability, doubt often becomes inevitable. However, what matters is how that doubt is resolved. When left unaddressed, it evolves into resentment, denial, and generational damage. The courtroom becomes the final stop where uncertainty must either be proven or released. One of the most striking aspects of these cases is how frequently personal testimony conflicts with documented evidence. Individuals arrive convinced that memory alone should suffice, yet the court demonstrates why modern jurisprudence demands more. This reflects the broader relationship between law and justice, where fairness depends not on who speaks most convincingly, but on what can be verified. Judge Lake carefully explains that emotional certainty does not equate to legal certainty. As DNA results are read, reactions vary widely. Relief, shock, vindication, and grief all surface simultaneously. These moments underscore why many people regret taking truth lightly earlier in their lives. Once the results are known, denial becomes impossible. The courtroom atmosphere shifts, not because the judge changes tone, but because reality finally settles in. These moments resemble the raw realizations often explored in long-form legal commentary, such as the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where outcomes permanently alter personal trajectories. In one case, the confirmation of shared biological parentage forces adult siblings to reevaluate decades of strained relationships. What was once dismissed as rumor becomes fact, and the emotional weight of that realization cannot be undone by a single ruling. Judge Lake acknowledges this directly, emphasizing that legal truth does not invalidate past pain. Instead, it provides a foundation upon which healing can begin. This approach aligns with the restorative themes often highlighted in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where acknowledgement precedes reconciliation. Another recurring issue addressed by the court is how children absorb uncertainty long before they understand it. Even when adults believe they have shielded them, children often sense instability. Judge Lake repeatedly emphasizes that clarity benefits children more than comforting lies. This perspective resonates strongly in cases involving Supreme Court child support principles, where long-term welfare outweighs short-term emotional convenience. The court also confronts how inconsistent behavior undermines credibility. Admissions of overlapping relationships, shifting timelines, and selective memory weaken personal claims, regardless of sincerity. Judge Lake does not moralize these behaviors. Instead, she explains their legal consequences. When credibility erodes, the court must rely even more heavily on forensic evidence. This is where DNA test cheating stories intersect with legal reality. Infidelity itself is not on trial, but its implications cannot be ignored. In addressing objections and disputes over testing procedures, Judge Lake references evidentiary standards to ensure fairness. She makes clear that refusing testing or challenging its legitimacy can lead to assumptions under the Adverse Inference in Evidence Act. However, the court prefers cooperation over compulsion, reinforcing the idea that participation in truth-finding ultimately benefits all parties involved. As proceedings advance, the courtroom also becomes a space for reflection on responsibility. Once paternity or kinship is established, the conversation shifts from "is this true?" to "what happens now?" Judge Lake consistently redirects parties toward constructive outcomes, co-parenting, respectful boundaries, and legal compliance. This forward-looking approach mirrors guidance often discussed in the Divorce Course podcast, where resolution is framed as a beginning rather than an ending. The court further highlights that identity is shaped not only by DNA, but by consistent presence and care. While biological truth matters, Judge Lake acknowledges the emotional bonds formed through years of parenting. However, she draws a firm boundary. Emotional bonds do not replace legal obligations. This balance ensures that children receive both emotional recognition and material support, reinforcing the court's commitment to justice over sentiment. Across all cases, the judicial tone remains measured and deliberate. Judge Lake allows emotional expression, but does not permit chaos to dictate outcomes. Her rulings demonstrate that structure is not coldness, it is protection. By maintaining order, the court prevents emotionally dominant voices from overpowering quieter truths. As the hearings conclude, it becomes evident that each family leaves changed, regardless of outcome. Some leave with relief, others with regret, but none leave uncertain. This finality is precisely what the court exists to provide. In this way, the proceedings resemble adoption stories' full episodes, where identity is clarified through documentation rather than assumption, even when the truth is difficult to accept. Ultimately, these cases collectively illustrate a core principle of modern jurisprudence. Truth, once established, creates responsibility. Whether that responsibility involves emotional healing, legal compliance, or long-term support, it cannot be ignored. Judge Lauren Lake's courtroom serves as the place where questions end and accountability begins. This segment of the description continues to emphasize that while the law cannot undo the past, it can prevent confusion from defining the future. Every DNA result, every ruling, and every closing statement reinforces the same message. Truth may be painful, but uncertainty is far more destructive. As the final phase of these courtroom proceedings unfolds, the broader meaning of each ruling becomes unmistakable. What began as individual disputes gradually forms a larger narrative about accountability, consequence, and the unavoidable power of truth. Under Judge Lauren Lake's steady leadership, the courtroom is transformed into a place where confusion ends, even when closure is uncomfortable. One of the most significant themes that emerges is how often people delay confronting reality because uncertainty feels safer than confirmation. Throughout these cases, individuals admit they suspected the truth for years but avoided testing out of fear. Judge Lake addresses this directly, explaining that avoidance does not protect families, it fractures them. This reality is why so many people later regret taking truth lightly, a theme frequently discussed in legal commentary and personal reflection platforms alike. The courtroom also highlights how the justice system serves as a final authority when personal relationships collapse under mistrust. Friends, relatives, and even partners often become unreliable narrators once emotions intensify. At that point, only verifiable evidence can restore balance. This reinforces the relationship between law and justice, showing that justice is not emotional satisfaction, but factual resolution applied fairly. In several cases, Judge Lake stresses that truth does not belong to any one party. It is not something to win or lose. Instead, truth belongs to the child, to the family structure, and to the future that follows the ruling. This framing removes the competitive nature of courtroom conflict and replaces it with responsibility. The concept of justice in jurisprudence is clearly demonstrated here. Justice is not punishment, but clarity enforced by law. As DNA results conclude lingering disputes, the court addresses the consequences that follow. Once biological ties are confirmed, legal obligations become unavoidable. Judge Lake explains that emotional distance or past conflict does not dissolve responsibility. This is particularly emphasized in matters involving ongoing care, nomming rights, and financial support, principles long upheld in Supreme Court child support jurisprudence. The emotional weight of these rulings is undeniable. Some parties feel validated, others feel exposed, and some experience both simultaneously. Judge Lake does not minimize these reactions, but she draws a firm boundary between emotional response and legal outcome. The courtroom is not a place for rewriting history. It is a place for acknowledging it. This distinction mirrors the difficult realizations often discussed in Truth Changes Everything podcast episodes, where acceptance follows revelation. Another critical lesson reinforced in these proceedings is how secrecy impacts identity. In sibling and kinship disputes, decades of misinformation distort self-perception and family roles. Judge Lake acknowledges that learning the truth later in life can feel destabilizing, but she also emphasizes that identity rooted in truth is stronger than identity built on denial. This perspective echoes themes found in Adoption Stories' full episodes, where clarity replaces confusion, even when emotions are complex. The court also confronts the misuse of narrative. In several cases, individuals attempt to shape outcomes through selective storytelling, omission, or exaggeration. Judge Lake methodically dismantles these efforts by returning to timelines, admissions, and forensic evidence. This approach demonstrates why the evidence stage in divorce case proceedings is essential. Without structure, emotion overwhelms fairness. When witnesses introduce rumors or second-hand accounts, Judge Lake clarifies their limited value. The court recognizes personal experiences, but it does not elevate them above verified facts. This judicial restraint prevents bias from influencing outcomes and avoids improper assumptions that could trigger adverse inference in Evidence Act complications. The message is clear. Cooperation with truth serves everyone better than resistance. As the final rulings are delivered, Judge Lake consistently redirects attention to the children affected. Regardless of adult conflict, the court prioritizes stability for minors. This includes legal recognition, consistent support, and respectful co-parenting. Judge Lake reminds the parties that once truth is established, their behavior moving forward matters more than their past mistakes. This forward-focused mindset aligns closely with principles discussed in the Divorce Course podcast, where resolution is framed as a responsibility, not a victory. In addressing couples whose marriages deteriorated under mistrust, Judge Lake speaks candidly about accountability. She explains that marriage without honesty becomes legally and emotionally unsustainable. While the court does not judge moral failure, it does enforce consequences. This approach reflects insights often explored in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal clarity forces personal change. Throughout the final moments of the proceedings, Judge Lake maintains a balance of firmness and empathy. She acknowledges pain without excusing harmful behavior. This balance reinforces public trust in the legal process, demonstrating that justice can be both compassionate and uncompromising. The final DNA confirmations close the door on speculation. Once the results are read, there is no appeal to belief or interpretation. The science stands. Judge Lake emphasizes that while DNA cannot repair relationships, it can prevent future harm caused by uncertainty. This is particularly relevant in cases where ongoing disputes could otherwise resurface repeatedly, damaging children and extended families alike. As court adjourns, the overarching lesson becomes unmistakable. Truth is disruptive, but necessary. Each family leaves with clarity, even if reconciliation remains a personal journey beyond the courtroom. Judge Lake reminds them that while the law cannot force healing, it can remove confusion, which is often the greatest obstacle to peace. These proceedings collectively demonstrate why the justice system relies on evidence rather than emotion. In matters of paternity, kinship, and responsibility, clarity protects the vulnerable and defines obligation. Whether through a DNA test, expert testimony, or judicial guidance, the court fulfills its purpose by establishing facts that no longer bend under pressure. In the end, this courtroom is not portrayed as a place of spectacle, but as a final checkpoint where lives change direction. Under Judge Lauren Lake's authority, truth is neither softened nor sensationalized. It is delivered plainly, because its impact is already profound. This final segment completes the description of a courtroom experience where science, law, and human consequence intersect. Every ruling reinforces the same principle. Once truth is revealed, responsibility begins, and from that moment forward, denial is no longer an option.